Okay, so the CTA component's done, and I can imagine that my fictional colleagues are gratefully importing that into whatever UI tasks they're working on ahead of our big product launch. But that's just the first building block in our order summary component. Next up, I need to do this annual plan thing, and although it's not exactly complicated, it's definitely less straightforward than the CTA in terms of layout. So I've put the mobile and the desktop versions side by side so that we can look at what's different between them, and there's not much really. The images are the same size, the gap between the image and the text is the same, but there are some differences. The font size increases slightly on the desktop, and the padding around the whole thing increases. So when I've finished the mobile version, I'm going to add a media query to the subcomponent to update those styles for desktop. Now when I'm looking at these designs, it's intuitively very clear to me how I want to structure this thing. But kind of the whole point of making these videos is to try to be explicit about the decisions that I'm making. Because I think developers who are a bit further along in their journey might think that the layout decisions here are obvious in some sense when they're not necessarily, unless you really understand the tools at your disposal and you have a handle on the assumptions that the UX or the UI designer is making when they put these design files together. So my breakdown is this. We have an annual plan component and it's ultimately a rectangle, as are all things in the CSS box model. And the question is, how do we arrange these 4 items inside it? What's the relationship between these things? Is there a relationship? Maybe all we need to do is use absolute positioning to lay out the design on mobile and desktop explicitly and use media queries. You could do that. But these days we expect UI to be responsive, meaning we want it to adapt to its circumstances with some degree of grace. This distance, for example, between the annual plan and the change link is much bigger on the desktop than on the mobile version, but we're not going to control that explicitly. We just want this distance to grow or shrink depending on the viewport, whether that's a device or just the browser being resized. So building up from the inside out, just as I'm doing with the order summary component as a whole, we've got the annual plan label, an annual plan price, and each is going to be in its own div and they're going to be grouped together within another div. Now, divs are block level elements by default, so we don't need to do anything else to arrange them vertically, but we do need to add some padding or margin to the left so that it will be separate from the image element. The image and the text block are going to be aligned vertically in a flex box, as will the annual plan change link, and at the top level of the internal layout is this other flex box with justify content space between, and that's going to keep the 2 flex boxes at opposite ends of the component with a responsive gap between them. In a moment I'm going to try to create all the markup for this whole component just with a single emmet expansion, just for fun. So before I do that, I want to make sure that I've got a path to my image so that I can reference that from inside the markup. While I remember, let me just go and comment out this anchor tag, which was the root of the previous component I was working on. Don't need that for just now. And then if I go into Figma, I could export this as an SVG, but then you need to unzip it and move the directories and rename it. So I've found a better way, which is if you right click into this item and go right down to the bottom, you've got a copy paste option. You can copy as SVG. And then that just puts the XML right into your clipboard, into your buffer, and you can go and create a new path. I'm calling this Quaver SVG, and paste the XML right in there. I've started using this VS Code keyboard shortcut a lot, which is Alt-Z, just to wrap the text, wrap the lines. And now I think I'm going to have a crack at this emmet expansion. Now, the next 3 minutes is completely irrelevant, so if you want to skip ahead to the time on screen, I wouldn't blame you. So we start out with the block level class for the whole component, which is annual plan. That's going to have a direct descendant, which is going to be the flex box called annual plan content left. I'm wrapping that in brackets so that I can come out and give it a sibling afterwards, so we're clustering these things together. Annual plan content left, which is going to be a flex box, and then a direct descendant of that is the first of the low-level items, an image, And if I put these brackets in, I can add the source as well, which is why we wanted our semiquaver SVG in the file path to make that available. So the image is going to have a sibling, which is a div, and we're going to attach no class to that because I'm going to get at that in the cascade. But within that div, we have the annual plan label. And then with the curly brackets, I can include the content that's going to sit within those tags, which is just the text annual plan. And that's got a sibling, which is annual plan price. And again, curly brackets, we can include the text in there, which is $59.99 a year. And then I'm going to close the yellow brackets here and add a sibling one level up, which is going to be the Flexbox annual plan content right, containing the change link, annual plan change link, that's going to be called. And I will use the href within square brackets. I can add that in at the same time. This is fun, isn't it? I'm sorry if it would have been easier to just do this as markup. It would have been easier for me too, you know, but you got to take risks. We're coming up to the end now anyway, so just sit tight for a second. Let's close off this thing, put a little octothorpe or hash symbol in there to represent the link destination. Changes the content. And look, it worked! If you're joining me from earlier on in the video, I'd like to congratulate you on your choice. I think you made the right decision by skipping forward. You haven't missed anything. Here is the markup that it would have been quicker to write in the first place. Save it, and we can see the contents displayed. Right, let's get on with this. We need to create a new CSS component called annualplan.css, and we will import that into our style sheet. Now we can start writing our top level CSS class here, annual plan. And the first thing I'm going to do is just set some default font sizes and weights for the component. Maybe stick the color on there as well. And then while it's in my mind, I'm just going to immediately overwrite those where I need to in the annual plan price element and also in the annual plan change link element. I gotta say, I'm not too happy with the color that we've got here on this change link because it doesn't look significantly different from what you would expect a link to look like under the normal user agent styles. So it doesn't look much better than a native link element. It does look different enough to look like a visited link instead of an unvisited link. So I think if I was really doing this as a work task, I'd be speaking to the designer and trying to negotiate a better solution than that. Anywho, let's talk a little bit about font sizes, because as I mentioned earlier, I'd prefer that they were factors or simple ratios of my 8 pixel rem size. To be really honest, I don't think that I'm going to be pulled up by a designer or by a QA if I happen to implement some microcopy at 16 pixels instead of 15 pixels. In the real world, sometimes you need to accommodate the preferences of a colleague or a client or a company executive. So to simulate that flexibility, I have made the 15 pixel text in the main component. I even did 14 pixels in the mobile size of this one, but it will be a cold day in hell before I set font size to 13 pixels directly or indirectly, unless it's part of a fluid type scale. So I think 14 pixels is going to be fine for that. And the next thing I want to do is bring these elements all up together so that they're in a row next to each other as they are in the design instead of being stacked on top of each other in a column. And I'm going to make use of CSS selectors to style some of the divs internally without allocating class names to them. Because one of the things that Tailwind has made me realize is that I value not having to come up with names for layout elements if I don't have to. I've already named an element of this component block, and there's only one direct child div in its scope, so I'm going to make use of that And that avoids me having to give it some other tenuous name. These things are on a new line because they are block level elements, but if we change that to inline block, then we have it sitting in line with our existing item, which is this image logo. And the other thing I want to do is add the margin left on here to just keep that respectful distance from the image logo as we discussed in the designs, and that's going to be the same on desktop as on mobile. The parent of this div I'm currently setting to inline block is actually needs to be a flex box. It doesn't need to be. There's other ways that we could set the alignment of these things vertically so that they're in the middle, but flex is just easy and it's right there. I'm using it all over the place in the components anyway, so I might as well keep things comprehensible and just use align items on a flex box to put these things in the middle like so. The display and align properties are the same for my annual plan content left as for annual plan content right, so I can just add that second selector to there. And then I give annual plan a display property of flex and justify content space between to push those two content flex boxes to either ends of the available space. Now it takes me a second to figure out why change link is not vertically aligned, and it's because I've copied the annual plan content class name without changing the modifier to right. Now I have to be honest, I am getting weary at this point, people, of narrating all this stuff, so I'm going to fast forward this bit where I'm just like doing some standard styling things. Background color comes from a variable, padding gets 2 rem on the mobile version, and border radius of course to make that nice and rounded. I think I stick a little bit of a gap between the annual plan label and the annual plan price just because it was in the design and I was too tired to think what else to do. So this brings us up to the point hopefully we can look at desktop. And this is the other place where I think it's really worthwhile doing these components as separate files and pulling them in, because I always get confused with media queries. Where should I put them? Should I list them underneath the properties that get changed on the different sizes? Should I put them all at the bottom? Should I do it in some other way? And this for me was a really good learning experience because it meant that I could say, okay, well, I will keep media queries within their components. It shouldn't cause problems with the scope, like where in the final style sheet they're introduced, because everything's got this BEM type naming going on, which should keep things limited. So this was a good point for me, and it just helped me clarify mentally where things are going to go. So I'm going to speed up the video, and it's just going to have me going on and sticking the padding changes to 3 rem, and the font sizes change a little bit, and I think that's it.